Vladimir Putin is eager for a compromise.
The leaders of every country on the planet, other than maybe the United States during the unipolar period, are forced by the nature of their jobs to compromise. Compromise is part of it. That's what diplomacy is. And he's among those. His position is clearly hardening. Russia has been rebuffed by the West. Vladimir Putin, I'm not flacking for Putin. I'm an American. I'm not going to live in Russia. I don't love Vladimir Putin. I'm stating the facts. He asked Bill Clinton to join NATO. He tried to make a missile deal.
He mentioned this in the interview.
He did, that's correct. And he's mentioned it in other forums as well. And NATO said, no, we don't want you. If the point of NATO, the point of NATO originally, of course, the post-war goal of NATO was to keep the Russians, the Soviets, from coming into Western Europe. It was a bulwark against the Russians. So if the Russians asked you to join the alliance, that would suggest you have solved the problem and you can move on to do something constructive with your life. But we refused. Just meditate on that. Go sit in the sauna for an hour and think about what that means. Putin wants to get out of this war. He's not going to become more open to negotiation the longer this goes on. One of the things we've learned in the course of the last 2 years is that Russia's industrial capacity is a lot more profound than we thought it was. I mean, Russia, this country we were assured was a gas station with nuclear weapons, has a pretty easy time making missiles, rockets, and artillery shells, whereas NATO doesn't. So we should think about what that means, one. Two, the West doesn't spend any time, or our policymakers in Washington spend no time thinking about, like, what are the achievable goals here? I have heard, personally, US government officials say, well, we're just gonna have to return Crimea to Ukraine. Well, you don't need to be a Russia scholar to know that's not going to happen short of a nuclear war. That's insane, actually. So even to say something like that reveals that you're a child, you don't understand the area at all, and you have no real sense of what's possible. And so as long as our leaders, and not simply in the US, but NATO, and I really mean Germany, don't take the time to learn about what's possible, we're not gonna get anywhere.
You think there is a big gap between the depths of understanding the philosophy of history between Biden and between Putin? Does Biden understand the law of action and reaction which moves a country like Russia?
I can't overstate how incapacitated Joe Biden is. That's not an attack. That is a fact. And anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. So these are not decisions Joe Biden is making. But there are capable people around Biden, and I know them. What they lack is any perspective at all. So a conversation with a US policymaker about the history of the region would begin and end with a conversation about, of course, Chamberlain and Churchill and Hitler, period. So the American policymaker historical template is tiny. In fact, there's only one. And it's a 2-year period in the late 1930s, and everything is based on that understanding of history and human nature, and that's insane. And so actually, American policymakers have convinced themselves that Vladimir Putin is going to take over Poland. And it is not a defense of Putin. I don't mean to defend Putin. I'm not a fan of Putin's, and I'm not a subject of Putin's. I'm an American. However, there's no evidence that Putin has any interest in expanding his borders. He is the largest country in the world, and it's very hard to run. They don't need natural resources. There's nothing in Poland he wants. There's nothing he will gain by taking Poland other than more trouble. So that is, if you're saying that he's going to invade Poland, you don't know what you're talking about.
You asked him, are you ready to invade Poland?
Are you an expansionist power?
Expansion, yes, in Poland. He said, only if Poland launched a war on Russia. Ukraine did not launch a war on Russia, and he invaded Ukraine. Why you didn't follow up on this question?
I started with that question, actually. But he treated me to 35 minutes of Catherine the Great and the Rus. But no, the core question is, why did he move his forces into eastern Ukraine? I watched this from a distant vantage in the United States, and I watched the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, go to the Munich Security Conference just days before that, in February of 2022, and say in a public forum at a press conference to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, we want you to join NATO, which is another way of saying, it's a synonym for, we plan to put nuclear weapons on Russia's
You think they threw a bait for him?
Are you joking? Of course they did. And it just tells you how constipated and restricted and censored the US media landscape is, that I was the only one who said that. Well, wait a second. The purpose of diplomacy is to reach a peaceful, mutually one hopes beneficial conclusion to a crisis. So if you're showing up voluntarily at the Munich Security Conference and saying, hey, Zelensky, why don't you allow us to put nuclear weapons on Russia's border? You're cruising for a war because you know that's the red line.